There's a version of every story that makes sense at first. The official version. The easy version. The one people accept and move on from. But when you start pulling it apart piece by piece, you begin to see how it was built. Every choice, every moment, every detail, like bricks laid one at a time. And when you look closer, things start to shift. Details don't line up, motives get complicated. And the truth isn't as clean as it seems. This is Killer Constructions. And this is a story that deserves a closer look. Before getting into this case, it's important to understand that it involves serious subject matter, including exploitation, manipulation, and harm involving vulnerable individuals. Nothing in this episode is described in a graphic way, but the nature of the case itself is difficult and may not be for everyone. If you choose to continue, just be aware of the weight behind what you're about to hear. At first, nothing about it stands out. Life looks structured, professional, creative. The kind of path that suggests discipline and control rather than chaos. The kind of work that exists inside systems where every detail matters, where everything is built intentionally, frame by frame, layer by layer, until it becomes something believable. That's where this case begins, not with a visible crime, not with a moment that immediately demands attention, but with a person who understood how to construct something convincing. Bolhem Bouchiba worked in animation, a field built entirely on illusion and precision. It's a space where nothing is accidental. Every movement is calculated. Every scene is designed to guide perception. That kind of background doesn't create the crime, but it shapes the way the story is told. It creates a public image built on control, craft, and structure, while the reality later uncovered in court pointed to something much darker. The contrast between the two versions is part of what makes the case so unsettling. For a long time, that surface remained intact. From the outside, there was little to suggest the extent of what investigators would eventually uncover. That is part of what makes cases like this so difficult to recognize early. The version presented to the world can look stable, predictable, and ordinary. It doesn't invite questions. It answers them before they're even asked. The professional credits, the polished reels, the signed-off projects. All of it fits into a narrative that feels safe, even prestigious. The person who signed contracts, credited on major films, and appeared in industry profiles was not the person who sat behind the screen arranging the hidden side of the story. But the reality of this case didn't exist on the surface. It existed in places that are not immediately visible. Digital spaces, private communications, patterns that don't stand out until someone knows exactly where to look. And that's where the case begins to shift. Because this was not a single isolated event, it was repeated. Ongoing, structured over time in a way that allowed it to continue without immediate interruption. Investigations into cases like this rarely begin with certainty. They start with fragments, small pieces of information that don't yet tell a full story, but that don't sit right either. A report, a flagged interaction, a pattern that appears out of place. On their own, those details are incomplete, but when they repeat, when they start to align, they create direction. And once investigators have direction, they can begin building the case in a way that holds up under scrutiny. In this case, that direction led into a network of digital activity. Communications that cross borders, interactions that relied on distance and anonymity, systems that allowed people to engage without ever being physically present. That distance is part of what makes these cases so complex, because it creates the illusion that harm is somehow less direct when it happens through a screen. But the law doesn't see it that way. The evidence doesn't see it that way. And the people harmed by it certainly don't experience it that way. The screen is not a shield, it is a conduit. As investigators began to examine the available data, patterns started to emerge. repeated contact, repeated access, behavior that was not random but intentional. And intention matters. It separates coincidence from involvement. It shows that something is happening not by chance, but by choice. That distinction becomes critical in any case built on digital evidence, because what may appear scattered at first can reveal a deliberate pattern when viewed as a whole. That is where the case begins to take shape, not as rumor, not as an assumption, but as structure. A series of actions connected by purpose, communications that were not isolated, but part of a broader pattern. Once that pattern becomes visible, the investigation shifts from observation to confirmation. The early fragments start to feel less like loose ends and more like a blueprint, something that was built with intention, not something that exploded at random. Digital evidence becomes central at that point. Messages, logs, records, data that shows not only that something occurred, but when it occurred, how it occurred, and who was involved. These are not abstract claims. They are traceable elements that investigators can compare, verify, and use to establish a timeline. And in a case like this, that timeline matters as much as anything else. It shows how the conduct wasn't an accident that happened once and then stopped. It was a repeated course of behavior stretching over years, each interaction reinforcing the structure instead of breaking it. The activity, according to reporting on the case, was not impulsive or chaotic. It followed a structure that allowed it to continue over time. That structure depended on communication, coordination, and access to vulnerable individuals. That is what gives the case its severity. It was a repeated course of conduct with lasting consequences for the people involved. The evidence suggested a pattern of behavior that wasn't just reactive. It was planned, maintained, and repeated. As more evidence was gathered, the connections became harder to ignore. What may have initially appeared as separate fragments began to align into a consistent pattern. The same methods, the same types of contact, the same underlying behavior repeated across different instances. And repetition has a way of removing uncertainty. It turns suspicion into something much harder to dismiss. At a certain point, the defense is no longer able to frame the conduct as a one-time lapse or a misunderstanding. The weight of recurrence starts to favor the idea that what was happening was deliberate and sustained. At that stage, investigators are no longer asking whether something happened. They are asking how it happened, how often it happened, and who was responsible for making it happen. That process is methodical. Every piece of evidence is documented. Every connection is checked. Every claim must stand up to scrutiny. Because a case like this cannot rest on broad impressions. It has to be built on proof. The investigation is no longer driven by intuition, but by a chain of evidence that can be followed, duplicated, and verified independently. And in this case, the proof continued to accumulate. Digital records showed consistent involvement. Communications helped demonstrate intent. The pattern itself made the behavior harder to explain away. Once that becomes clear, the case moves from investigation toward accountability. The focus shifts from, is this possible, to how can this be proven in court? And then finally, how can this be understood in a way that reflects the full gravity of what occurred? Authorities were able to connect those digital traces back to a real person. Not an anonymous presence, not an untraceable identity, a real individual whose actions could be tied to the evidence that had been collected. And that changes the shape of the case, because once an identity is established, the story becomes much more concrete. It is no longer just about online behavior. It is about a specific person making specific choices that led to real harm. The screen no longer provides a buffer. The digital distance no longer feels like a barrier. The person behind the username is no longer a ghost. They are sitting in court, facing the consequences of the pattern that has been pieced together. Now it is no longer about abstract misconduct in a digital space. It is about a person who took action, repeated that action, and participated in conduct that caused serious damage to others. The anonymity of the internet may have created distance, but it did not create immunity. The distance may have made detection slower and the trail more complex, but it did not erase the chain of evidence. The harm still exists, the record still exists, the pattern still exists, and the people who suffered from it are still real. The legal process that follows is built on the evidence that investigators and prosecutors can actually prove. Charges are not based on impressions or speculation. They are based on what can be shown clearly and consistently in court. In this case, the charges reflected the seriousness of the actions and the repeated nature of the conduct. The involvement was not limited. It was structured, documented, repeated over time. The prosecution was not relying on general statements or vague accusations. It was building its case on data, timelines, and patterns that could be traced back to specific decisions and specific acts. During proceedings, the focus shifts from investigation to presentation. The evidence is laid out, the patterns are explained, the connections are made clear. The purpose is not to create drama, it is to show what already exists within the record. The judge and jury are not being asked to believe in a story. They are being asked to look at the evidence and see for themselves how the pieces fit together. And when the evidence is strong, it doesn't need embellishment. It speaks through its own consistency. The dates line up, the methods repeat, the involvement is traceable, the impact is documented. The court examines not only isolated actions, but the larger pattern those actions form. Repetition, intent, coordination. The broader context matters because it shows whether the conduct was accidental, incidental, or deliberate. The law can look at a single interaction and say it might be ambiguous. But when that interaction is repeated over and over again, it becomes much harder to maintain that it was accidental. The pattern tells a story that the individual might prefer to ignore, but the court cannot ignore it. And in this case, the court ultimately found enough to support a serious conviction. That outcome reflects not just the acts themselves, but their sustained nature and the harm they caused. The sentence followed from that finding. Bouchiba was sentenced to 25 years in prison, along with long-term socio-judicial monitoring and a permanent ban on working in any profession involving minors. That result reflects the gravity of the offenses and the court's view of the repeated harm involved. It is also a reminder that cases like this do not end when the investigation ends. They continue through the legal process, where the final judgment must reflect the full weight of what was proven. The sentence is not just about punishment, it is also about signaling a threshold, a boundary between what society will tolerate and what it cannot accept without consequence. Reporting on the case indicates that the pattern of abuse affected hundreds of children, many of them as young as 3 and up to around 15 years old. The scale of the harm is staggering, not just because of the number of victims, but because of the way that pattern was repeated over the years. When you're talking about children in that age range, the capacity for harm is amplified simply by who they are. Still developing, still trusting, still learning what the world is supposed to be. To hear that behavior continued across so many lives is not just disturbing. The law can assign a sentence, and the evidence can map out the pattern, but no number can truly capture the weight of having hundreds of children affected by that structure. But the case does not end there, because questions about how that pattern was built, hidden, and finally exposed linger long after the sentence is handed down. Technology creates distance. Distance creates delays. And delay allows harmful patterns to continue longer than they should. The person who appeared professional and stable in public was operating a separate reality behind the scenes. And the contrast between those two versions is what makes the case so difficult to process. When the evidence made that connection clear, the public image could no longer hold. It was dismantled piece by piece, as each part of the pattern became visible. It's worth sitting with how hard these kinds of cases are to detect at all. The very systems that make global collaboration, instant communication, and remote work possible also create spaces where harm can be arranged quietly, behind layers of payment records, encrypted chats, and cross-border servers. By the time an investigator notices one fragment, it may already be several layers deep into a pattern that has been running for years. There is no single moment when the structure appears on a screen. It only becomes visible in retrospect, once the pattern is complete and the chain of decisions is finally laid out. In parallel, there's the slow, painful reality for the victims, the awareness that what happened is not one isolated event, but part of a repeated system that someone returned to over and over again. That awareness doesn't vanish when the sentence is announced. It lives in the way they see the world, trust adults, or encounter screens for the rest of their lives. At the same time, the case also forces a confrontation with the way success and reputation can blur people's judgment. The fact that Bolhem Bouchiba's work was known from major animated films meant that, for many, it was easier to believe the creative professional than to entertain the idea that the same person would be involved in the opposite kind of behavior. The polished image of the animator, the traveled professional, the collaborator on respected projects, all of that formed a kind of immunity in the public mind, a buffer that made it harder to take in the reality once it emerged. When that buffer finally collapsed, it didn't just change the way people saw him, it forced a much broader reckoning with the idea that the people who seemed the most composed, the most talented, and the most stable can also be the ones who have been the most careful about hiding what they're doing. The systems that made that possible still exist. The tools that allow someone to operate from one country while harm occurs in another, to communicate through intermediaries, to pay through digital channels, and to keep logs fragmented across platforms. All of that structure is still in place. Nothing in the sentence automatically rewrites those systems. It simply demonstrates what can happen when they are exploited. The discomfort of that realization is part of why the case sticks around in the public memory even after the headlines fade. It doesn't just ask, what did this one person do? It asks, what do we allow to go unnoticed as long as it doesn't cross into plain sight? And that brings us back to the children. The sentence is a legal conclusion, not a cleanse. The damage that was done to hundreds of children, spanning from early childhood into early adolescence, does not reset just because the court reaches a decision. These are not abstract victims in a statistic. They are people whose development has been altered, whose trust has been warped, and whose relationship to safety and authority has been permanently reshaped. The investigation can trace the pattern, the court can sentence the offender, and the public can hear the story. But the real work of living with that history belongs to the survivors. The way society responds, how it supports, protects, and believes them long after the case ends, is part of the same structure that either hides or exposes harm. And when you step back and look at it as a whole, it follows a structure. Not random, not chaotic, but built over time, piece by piece, through choices that seemed small in isolation, but became significant when combined. The repeated contact, the repeated access, the repeated behavior. All of it formed a pattern that could no longer be ignored once the evidence lined up. The surface version of the story no longer matched the reality behind the screen. The case of Bolhem Bouchiba is a reminder that not all structures are visible. Some exist beneath the surface, built quietly, maintained carefully, and designed to avoid attention. But that doesn't make them stable. It just delays the moment they're exposed. The carefully managed image may hold up for years, but it cannot survive the weight of the pattern once it is finally laid out. And when they are exposed, they don't just break. They reveal everything that was holding them together. The small moments, the ignored warnings, the decisions that didn't seem important at the time. All of it stacked together like bricks until something finally gives. The case does not end at the sentence. It continues in the questions it leaves behind, about how technology shapes temptation, about how perception can be manipulated, and about how long it can take for a hidden structure to finally collapse under the weight of what it tried to hide. This is Killer Constructions, and I'll see you in the next one.